Good afternoon and welcome to Chapter 7 of Girlcott. Once Eileen and I left Papa's garage with my mobilette and we were off Loquat Lane and towards Parsons Road, I decided to let Eileen tow me because I was too nervous to be the rider. I trembled the entire way, barely holding on to her waist, and she had to warn me about wiggling. "You're going to give me a flop," she screamed. We had just avoided the sidewalk and almost became victims of road rash. "It's not my fault we're in this mess," I yelled and regretted my words when her shoulders rounded and she said no more about my wiggling. The rest of the journey was shrouded in silence, and I was relieved when we reached her house without any incident. The houses in Eileen's neighborhood were smaller than those on Loquat Lane, and many needed painting and the roofs whitewashed. Benny at least kept their rented pink cottage presentable, although the landlord ignored much-needed repairs. The handkerchief-sized lawn was well kept, and Benny had attached a swing to the Pride of India tree for Marvin to enjoy. Near the front door was a rose bush with vibrant red and yellow flowers Eileen had planted. When we rode up to the cottage, Nona was standing at the gate with a crying Marvin beside her. I noticed that his blue faded pajamas with almost invisible multicolored puppies were wet in the front. "You're just in time, girl. Willis is on his way," she snapped. Hardly were the words out of her mouth when a motorcycle screeched to a stop in front of the gate, and a tall fellow, a little older than Benny, wearing a tight black jumpsuit, balanced the bike with his big feet wide apart. Without looking at either Eileen or me, he tapped the back seat 3 times for Nona to jump on. This she did, and they rode off without a backward glance. I grabbed the mobilette as Eileen jumped off. She ran to hug the bawling Marvin while I stood gaping at the scene. "I'm glad I took this chance," I said, and meant every word. "You're the best of best friends," Eileen said, shouting to drown out the racket Marvin was making. "You better get home before Auntie Dora and Uncle Lionel come from church." Then she looked at her watch. "It's almost 10:30. An uncomfortable silence crept between us as I watched her calm down Marvin by picking him up, wet pajamas and all. "Sorry I said what I said. I was feeling ashamed that I was ever angry with her. Poor Marvin would have been left alone again, and goodness knows what would have happened to him this time." She walked over and hugged me, and I didn't even mind getting close to poor little Marvin, who had been wet long enough to pollute the entire June breeze. "I wish you were my sister," she said, her voice quivering. "I can never repay you for taking this chance. Be careful riding back home." I knew if I hesitated any longer, we would both be bawling loud enough to form a trio and alarm the neighborhood. The street should be deserted. I looked up around at the squares of light that shone through the houses. At least I hope so. I gave Eileen one last hug and pecked Marvin on his forehead to avoid the salty cheeks. "I'll talk to Benny about us getting into the theater without crossing the picket line," she said. "I'll have something to tell you when I come to school tomorrow." Her words gave me hope as I rode off. My heart thumped faster than the motor in my cycle when I concentrated on riding my mobilette. It wasn't that I was nervous, for Papa had allowed me to become familiar with it by riding up and down Loquat Lane. I turned onto the narrow, dark road near Bernard's Park. I knew this route was usually deserted, and so far there was no one in sight. A gentle breeze not only seemed to push me along, but it encircled me like a guardian angel. Overhead was a moon, not quite full, but shining faintly in a navy blue sky, dotted with what seemed like 1,000,000,000,000 freckles. The moon was like a smiling mouth, giving me the confidence to turn off my headlight and raise my speed from 20 miles an hour to 25. My eyes became accustomed to the darkness, and I was able to see ahead without any trouble. Then I heard it, a scraping sound on the unpaved old railway tracks. As it grew louder, I realized the sound was just a few yards ahead. A car. I could barely make out the outline, for the headlights were also turned off. I froze as the car drew closer and closer. I turned off my motor, jumped off my mobilette, and dragged it behind an oleander hedge that was fortunately close by. I crouched down as far as I could, balancing my bike at the same time. Why would a car have its headlights off? Maybe this was the way the police caught lawbreakers at night. I looked around for an escape. There were more bushes behind me, and I had no idea where they ended. I thought of running through them, but there was no way I was going to leave my precious mobilette behind. The car stopped a few feet in front of my hiding place. Both passenger doors flew open and 2 people jumped out. I sucked in my breath, waiting to be pulled out of the bushes. The person nearest me had a large sheet of paper in front of him like a flag being unfurled. In an instant, he was joined by a woman carrying a small jar. She opened it, dipped a brush in its contents, and began smearing something thick and white on the paper from one corner to the next. They had no idea they were being watched, but my heart was thumping so loud I feared that they could hear the sound. I inched closer to the bushes and watched them cover the paper. What was this all about? My eyes were fastened on what was happening next. Clambering up the bank, the man held the paper precariously in front of him without stumbling or losing his balance. Reaching the Marsh Folly Road above, and slapped the paper on the nearest telephone pole. When her face turned around in my direction, I gasped. I recognized Mrs. Burrows, my favorite maths teacher. I covered my face and then remembered she could not see me hidden behind the thick bushes. Without another glance, she disappeared back into the back seat and the car drove away, still without lights, leaving the railway tracks more deserted than before. When it reached the Marsh Folly Road, the man also disappeared into the back seat, as the car drove away, all evidence of them having been there vanished into the darkness. The night was warm, but my teeth chattered. The scene was not only puzzling, but frightening, so frightening I could not move. Eventually, curiosity melted my fear, and I stealthily crept from behind the bushes and inched my way up to the bank, to the Marsh Folly Road, to see what the man had slapped on the telephone pole. Large black letters stared back at me from the poster, down with segregation in the theaters. I gaped at the 6 ominous words, and then my eyes traveled to the smaller letters underneath. Boycott the theaters beginning Monday. A giant hand seemed to grab my chest and squeeze the breath from my body. How could Mrs. Burrows, the sensible teacher who inspired me to be an actuary, be a part of that progressive group? I realized that the person who pasted the flyer on the telephone pole must be her husband, and I was certain the driver was a Bermudian. Foreigners did not drive Bermuda cars. Did that mean the progressive group was Bermudian? The poster became blurred, and I scrambled back down to my mobilette. I eased it from behind the bushes, my heart beating fast enough to take over the motor in my bike. Throwing all of my fears to the wind, I rode over the speed limit for the rest of the distance, not even thinking I might be stopped by a policeman. What I had seen created a mixture of fear and curiosity. Why was Mrs. Burrows in the progressive group? When I arrived home, the outside light was still burning, a sure sign that my parents had not returned from church. I almost fell on the kitchen floor in relief. At least I had been lucky to put the mobilette back into Papa's garage and get into the kitchen without another incident. Before I closed the door, I saw with horror that Mrs. Charter was sitting on her kitchen window, her nose pressed against the screen. "Have a good night, dear, Desma?" she called out. I closed the door without answering. "It never rains, but it pours," was one of Mama's favorite proverbs. Bad luck was drenching my entire body.